Lyra Ashford woke up with her hands pinned to the frozen ground, and a circle of wolves closing in around her. She could smell their anger before she could see their faces. This was not training. This was not a game. Someone had dragged her from her den in the middle of the night and thrown her into the training pit while the rest of the pack still slept, and now 6 wolves stood over her with their teeth bared, waiting for a command that never should have been given. She rolled to her side and pushed herself up, her arms shaking from the cold, and from something deeper than cold. Fear. Not for herself, not anymore. She had grown used to that particular flavor of fear years ago. This was a different kind. Someone wanted her gone, and they wanted it to look like an accident. A voice called out from the shadows at the edge of the pit, low and amused. Cale Hale stepped into the moonlight, his arms crossed, his grin sharp enough to cut. He did not need to shift to look dangerous. He never had. "Nobody is going to miss the runt," he said. "Do it quick." The wolves advanced. Lyra's heart slammed against her ribs, but she did not run. Running was what they wanted. Running would prove every terrible thing they had ever said about her. So instead, she planted her feet in the mud, closed her eyes for one single breath, and waited for the fire that had been sleeping inside her for 18 years to finally wake up. This was the night everything changed. But to understand how Lyra Ashford ended up in that pit, surrounded by wolves who wanted her dead, you have to go back to the beginning, to the day she was born, and the pack decided, before she had even opened her eyes, that she was worthless. The Ashford pack was one of the oldest and strongest wolf packs in the Northern Territories. Their bloodline stretched back for generations, filled with warriors, hunters, and leaders whose names were carved into the stone walls of the Great Hall. Damon Ashford, the pack's beta, had married a woman named Celine, a quiet outsider who came from a small, forgotten pack far to the west. Nobody knew much about her family, only that she had kind eyes and a gentle laugh, and that Damon loved her more than he loved his own title. Celine died the night Lyra was born. The birth had been difficult, and by the time the pack healer arrived, there was nothing left to do but hold Celine's hand and promise her that her daughter would be safe. Damon never fully recovered from that loss. He looked at his newborn daughter and saw, instead of a new beginning, the reason his wife was gone. It did not help that Lyra's first shift, when she was 6 years old, produced a wolf that shocked the entire pack. While other pups shifted into strong, dark-coated wolves with sharp eyes and steady legs, Lyra's wolf came out small, pale and thin, with fur the color of morning frost, and eyes that seemed to shimmer strangely in the light. The pack elders whispered that something was wrong with her. The children laughed and called her the Ghost Runt. The name stuck, and it followed her through every year that came after. Lyra grew up in the shadow of that name. She was not cruel to anyone, and she never gave the pack a real reason to hate her. But pity and disgust do not need reasons. They only need a target, and she was an easy one. Her father barely spoke to her. He gave her food and shelter because pack law required it, but he never once told her she was loved. And by the time she was old enough to understand what love was supposed to feel like, she had stopped expecting it from him. Still, Lyra did not give up. Every single night, long after the rest of the pack had gone quiet, she slipped out into the forest behind the training grounds and practiced alone. She ran until her lungs burned. She practiced her shift until her body ached from the effort. She was not naturally strong, and she knew it, but she believed, somewhere deep inside her chest, that effort could make up for what nature had denied her. Nobody was there to see it. Nobody clapped when she finally managed to leap over the fallen log that had tripped her 100 times before. But she kept going anyway, because giving up felt like agreeing with everyone who had already decided she was nothing. The pack was preparing for something big that season. The old alpha, Alaric Hale, had led the Ashford pack for over 20 years, and everyone understood that his strength was beginning to fade. Soon there would be trials to determine the next generation of leaders, and soon after that, a choosing ceremony, where the strongest young wolves would be paired together to strengthen the pack's bloodline for the future. It was considered the greatest honor a young wolf could receive. Lyra knew, without anyone having to tell her, that she would never be chosen for anything. Cale Hale, the alpha's only son, was the golden example of everything Lyra was not. He was fast, strong, clever in the way that made other wolves want to follow him, and cruel in the way that made them too afraid to say no. He had decided, somewhere around the time they were both children, that mocking Lyra was one of his favorite pastimes. and the rest of the young pack members followed his lead, the way water follows a slope downhill. It was easier to laugh with Kale than to stand beside the girl he laughed at. Training sessions were the worst part of Lyra's days. The pack trainer, a broad-shouldered wolf named Garrett, paired her against opponents twice her size, not out of cruelty exactly, but because he genuinely believed pain was the fastest teacher. Lyra lost every match. She was thrown into the dirt, pinned, laughed at, and told to try again, and she did try again, every single time, even when her whole body screamed at her to stop. One afternoon, after a particularly rough session where she had been pinned by a boy 2 years younger than her, Lyra limped away from the training grounds and sat down beside the old stone well near the edge of the pack's territory. She pressed her hand against her ribs where a bruise was already forming and stared out at the tree line, wondering, not for the first time, if there was something actually broken inside her. That was when she noticed the old woman watching her from the doorway of the healer's hut. Agatha Wren was the oldest living member of the Ashford pack, blind since birth, but known throughout pack history for a strange and uncanny ability to sense things other wolves could not. Most pack members treated her with a mixture of respect and unease. Agatha rarely spoke, and when she did, her words tended to mean more than they seemed to on the surface. "Come here, child," Agatha said, her voice as dry and light as autumn leaves. Lyra hesitated, then walked over, favoring her bruised side. Agatha reached out with one wrinkled hand and touched Lyra's arm, her clouded eyes fixed somewhere just past Lyra's shoulder. "You smell different than the others," Agatha said quietly. "Not weaker, different, like something waiting for the right season to bloom." Lyra almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Everyone says I'm weak." "Everyone is not always right," Agatha replied. She patted Lyra's arm once, then turned and shuffled back into her hut without another word, leaving Lyra standing alone by the well, with a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirring in her chest. It was not quite hope. She had learned a long time ago not to trust hope. But it was something close to it, small and quiet, like a single candle flame in a very large, very dark room. Lyra carried those words with her for weeks afterward, turning them over in her mind during the long hours of training and the longer hours of loneliness that followed. She did not tell anyone what the old woman had said. She had learned that sharing anything about herself, even a small hopeful thing, usually gave the pack another reason to laugh. Instead, she began watching the older wolves more carefully. She noticed the way the strongest fighters moved, not just their strength but their timing, their patience, the way they waited for an opening instead of rushing in. She began practicing those small things at night, alone in the clearing behind the training grounds, testing footwork and balance long after her muscles begged her to stop. She was there again, on a cold evening, moonlight slipping through the bare branches overhead, when she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, expecting Kale or one of his friends come to mock her again, but instead found a boy named Finn Whitlock standing at the edge of the clearing, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she was not used to seeing directed at herself. It looked almost like curiosity. Finn was not part of Kale's circle. He kept mostly to himself, spending his time helping the pack's hunters instead of chasing status among the younger wolves. Lyra had exchanged maybe a dozen words with him over the years, none of them meaningful. "You train out here every night," he said. It was not quite a question. Lyra straightened, suddenly self-conscious. "Somebody has to, since nobody wants to train with me during the day." Finn's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "That's not because you're bad. It's because Kale decided a long time ago that everyone has to hate you, and most people are too lazy to think for themselves." Lyra did not know what to say to that. Nobody had ever put it so plainly before, and certainly nobody had ever suggested that the problem might belong to Kale rather than to her. Finn shrugged, kicked at a stone on the ground, and turned to leave. "Just so you know," he said over his shoulder, "I don't think you're weak. I think you're just tired of everyone deciding what you are, before you get the chance to show them otherwise." He disappeared into the trees before Lyra could respond, leaving her standing alone in the clearing with her heart beating strangely fast, not from exertion this time, but from the simple, unfamiliar shock of being seen. That small conversation did not change her life overnight. The pack did not suddenly grow kinder, and Kale did not suddenly stop his cruelty, but it planted something in Lyra that had not been there before. a tiny, stubborn certainty that maybe, just maybe, she was not as broken as everyone believed. The days rolled forward, one after another, each one filled with small humiliations and small victories that nobody else noticed. Lyra kept training. She kept enduring. And somewhere deep inside her, in a place she did not yet understand, something ancient and powerful continued to sleep, waiting patiently for the moment it would finally be needed. It would not have to wait much longer. The choosing ceremony was only weeks away now, and the whole pack could feel the shift in the air, the way animals sense a storm long before the first clouds appear on the horizon. Alpha Alaric Hale had grown noticeably weaker over the past several months, and though nobody said it aloud, everyone understood that this choosing ceremony would likely be one of his last acts as leader. The pressure to make it perfect, to prove that the Ashford bloodline remained strong, weighed on every family with a young wolf old enough to be considered. Damon Ashford, Lyra's father, had never once mentioned putting her name forward for consideration. It was such an obvious, unspoken fact that Lyra had never even allowed herself to imagine otherwise. She was the ghost runt. Nobody wanted the ghost runt's bloodline mixed into the pack's future. Still, some tiny foolish part of her wondered what it might feel like to be seen, even once, as something worth choosing. She got her answer sooner than she expected, and it was not the answer she had hoped for. The morning after her strange encounter with Finn, Lyra arrived at the training grounds to find the entire clearing buzzing with unusual energy. Wolves in both human and shifted form gathered in small clusters, whispering and glancing toward the great hall, where an announcement had apparently already begun. Lyra pushed her way closer, catching fragments of conversation as she went. The choosing ceremony has been moved up. Alaric wants it done before the frost trials begin. They say Kale already knows who he's picking. Lyra's stomach twisted. She had assumed she still had months to prepare herself for the humiliation that was surely coming, months to build some kind of emotional armor thick enough to survive being publicly overlooked. Instead, it seemed the ceremony would happen within days, not weeks. She found a spot near the back of the crowd, half hidden behind a broad oak tree, and watched as Garrett, the pack trainer, climbed the wooden platform at the front of the clearing to make the official announcement. His voice boomed out over the gathered pack, confirming what she had already overheard. The choosing ceremony would take place in 3 days' time, moved forward at the Alpha's request due to rising tensions with a neighboring pack that made a display of strength and unity more urgent than ever. 3 days. Lyra felt something cold settle in her chest. She was not naive enough to think she had ever stood a real chance of being chosen, but 3 days felt suddenly, brutally final, like a door slamming shut on a possibility she had never even let herself fully imagine. Kale stood near the front of the crowd, soaking in the attention with the ease of someone who had never once doubted his place in the world. Several of the pack's strongest young female wolves glanced his way, some hopeful, some calculating. Lyra watched it all from the shadows, and felt, for the first time in a long while, a sharp and unexpected surge of anger rather than sadness. It was not fair. None of it had ever been fair. She had spent years training in secret, pushing herself past exhaustion, and none of it mattered, because the pack had already decided, long before she could prove otherwise, exactly what she was worth. She turned to leave before anyone could notice her standing there, but a voice stopped her. "Look who crawled out from wherever she hides," Kale called out, loud enough for half the clearing to hear. Lyra froze. Slowly, she turned back around, forcing her expression to stay flat and unreadable, a skill she had practiced almost as much as her fighting stance. Kale sauntered toward her, several of his friends trailing behind him like shadows. "Excited for the ceremony, Ghost?" he asked, his tone dripping with false sweetness. "Or are you finally smart enough to know you don't belong anywhere near that platform?" Laughter rippled through the nearby wolves. Lyra kept her chin level, refusing to let her eyes drop. "I didn't realize belonging was something you got to decide," she said quietly. A flicker of surprise crossed Kale's face, quickly replaced by irritation. He was not used to her talking back. "Watch yourself," he said, his voice losing its playful edge. "You're only still here because pack law says we can't throw you out without cause. Don't go giving me one." Lyra held his gaze for one long moment, refusing to be the first to look away, and then she turned and walked into the trees, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She did not run. She would not give him the satisfaction. But once she was far enough into the forest that the pack's voices faded behind her, she allowed herself to sink down against a tree trunk and press her hands against her face, breathing hard, fighting back the sting behind her eyes. She would not cry. She had promised herself years ago that she would never cry where the pack could smell it on her, and she intended to keep that promise even now, alone in the forest with nobody watching. When she finally lifted her head, the forest around her had gone strangely quiet. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lyra frowned, her instincts prickling with an old, ancestral kind of caution that every wolf carried somewhere in their bones. Someone was watching her. She rose slowly to her feet, scanning the trees, and found a figure standing at the edge of a small clearing perhaps 30 feet away, half hidden in the shadow of a wide elm. It was a woman, tall and pale, wrapped in a dark green cloak that seemed to blend with the forest itself. Her eyes, when they met Lyra's, glowed faintly silver in the dim light, unmistakably not human, and not entirely wolf either. Lyra's every instinct screamed danger, but curiosity, stronger and stranger than fear, kept her rooted in place. "You have been crying," the woman said, her voice carrying an odd, musical quality, like wind moving through hollow reeds, "but not for the reason you think." "Who are you?" Lyra managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is Ashford territory. You shouldn't be here." The woman smiled, though there was something sad in it. "My name is Elowen, and I am not here by accident, child. I have been watching you for some time now, waiting for you to be alone enough, and desperate enough, to finally listen." Lyra's pulse quickened. "Listen to what?" Elowen stepped closer, moving with a grace that made no sound at all against the fallen leaves. "To the truth about what you are," she said, "and what has been sleeping inside you since the day you were born." The forest seemed to lean in around them, holding its breath along with Lyra, as the stranger's words hung in the cold evening air, promising answers to questions Lyra had never dared to ask out loud. Lyra did not move. Every lesson she had ever learned about caution told her to turn and run back toward the safety of the pack, yet something about this stranger's presence felt less like a threat and more like a door she had been standing in front of her entire life without knowing it was there. "You said something has been sleeping inside me," Lyra said carefully. "What does that mean?" Elowen tilted her head, studying Lyra with those strange silver eyes. "Tell me, child, has anyone ever spoken to you about your mother's family, where she came from before she joined the Ashford pack?" Lyra's throat tightened. "My mother died when I was born. My father never talks about her. Nobody does." "That does not surprise me," Elowen said, her voice growing quieter. "Selene came from a bloodline that most packs believe died out centuries ago, a line so old and so rare that even its name has become more legend than fact among the northern packs. They were called the Diamond Wolves." Lyra almost laughed, though nothing about the moment felt funny. "Diamond Wolves, that sounds like a story parents tell pups to help them sleep." "Many true things sound like stories after enough centuries have passed," Elowen replied. "The Diamond Wolves were guardians once, protectors chosen not by strength alone, but by the purity of their spirit. Their wolves did not simply fight, they shielded, they healed. They could turn the tide of entire wars with a single united charge. But their numbers were small, and small numbers make easy targets. Whole bloodlines were hunted to near extinction generations ago by those who feared power they could not control." Lyra shook her head slowly. "Even if that's true, what does it have to do with me? My wolf is small. Weak. Everyone in the pack has seen it 100 times." Elowen's expression softened into something that looked almost like pity, though not the cruel kind Lyra was used to receiving from the pack. "That is because your true wolf has never once been allowed to wake," she said. "What the pack has seen these past 12 years is only a shadow, a suppressed form, held back by something powerful enough to keep even a diamond bloodline dormant." "Held back by what?" Lyra asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "By grief," Elowen said simply, "and by fear. Your mother knew what she carried inside her daughter, and she also knew what happened to bloodlines like hers when the wrong people discovered their potential. Before she died, she placed a binding on you, a protective seal meant to hide your true nature until you were strong enough and safe enough to survive its awakening." The forest around them seemed to grow colder. Lyra wrapped her arms around herself, trying to process words that felt too large and too strange to hold on to. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Why not years ago, when it might have actually helped?" "Because bindings such as your mother's do not last forever," Elowen said. "They weaken over time, especially when the one who carries them is pushed toward true desperation, true danger. I have watched the threads of that binding growing thin for months now. Soon, whether you are ready or not, it will break entirely." A twig snapped somewhere behind Lyra, sharp and sudden in the quiet forest. She spun around, but there was nothing there, only shadows shifting between the trees. When she turned back, Elowen had retreated several steps, her expression suddenly alert and cautious. "I cannot stay longer," the woman said quickly. "Others are already searching for me, and it is not safe for either of us if I am found here. Remember what I have told you, Lyra Ashford. When your wolf finally wakes, do not fear it. Do not hide it. It has waited far too long already." Before Lyra could ask another question, Elowen turned and disappeared into the deeper shadows of the forest, moving with a speed that seemed almost impossible, leaving no trace behind, except the faint, lingering scent of pine, and something else Lyra could not quite name. Something old and clean, like the smell of the air right after a storm. Lyra stood alone in the clearing for a long time afterward, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers yet. Diamond wolves, a binding placed by her dying mother, a truth that had been hidden from her for her entire life. It sounded impossible, the kind of story a lonely, desperate girl might invent to comfort herself. And yet something about it felt true in a way she could not explain. A quiet certainty settling into her bones the same way Agatha Wren's strange words had settled there weeks earlier. She walked back toward the pack grounds slowly, her thoughts racing far ahead of her feet. If there was even a small chance that Elowen's words were true, then somewhere in the pack's records, somewhere in her father's silence, there had to be proof. And Lyra intended to find it, no matter how carefully it had been buried. That night, long after the rest of the den had gone quiet, Lyra crept through the narrow hallway toward her father's private study, a room she had entered only a handful of times in her entire life. Damon Ashford kept the door locked most days, but Lyra had learned the trick of the old latch years ago, back when she used to sneak in as a small child hoping to find some trace of the mother she had never known. The study smelled of old parchment and cedar wood. Shelves lined every wall, filled with pack records, treaties, and genealogies stretching back generations. Lyra lit a small candle and began searching methodically, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled down box after box of yellowed documents. It took nearly an hour before she found it, a slim, leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of formal pack ledgers, its cover worn soft from years of handling. She opened it carefully and recognized the handwriting immediately, delicate and looping, nothing like her father's blocky script. It could only belong to one person, her mother. Lyra sank down onto the study floor, the candle flickering beside her, and began to read. The early entries were simple, almost mundane, notes about daily pack life, small observations about the forest, quiet affection for a man Lyra assumed was her father. But as she turned the pages, the entries grew more guarded, more careful, as though Celine had been writing in a kind of code even she was frightened to fully spell out. "They must never know where I truly came from," one entry read. "If the wrong ears hear the name of my bloodline, my daughter will never know a moment's peace." Another entry, dated only weeks before Lyra's birth, made her breath catch entirely. "I feel her moving inside me, and even now, I sense the fire she carries. It is beautiful, and it terrifies me in equal measure. I will do what must be done to protect her until she is ready. I only pray I live long enough to explain it to her myself." Lyra closed the journal slowly, her hands shaking, tears finally slipping free despite every promise she had made herself never to cry where anyone might notice. But there was no one here to see her now, only the candle and the quiet, and the overwhelming weight of a truth she had waited her entire life to find. Her mother had not died leaving her broken. Her mother had died trying to protect something powerful enough to require protecting. Lyra tucked the journal carefully inside her jacket, blew out the candle, and slipped back toward her room before her father could wake and discover her missing. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning Elowen's words and her mother's hidden journal over and over in her mind, feeling for the first time in years something dangerously close to hope. Whatever slept inside her, whatever her mother had fought so hard to protect, it was still there, waiting. And soon, whether the pack was ready for it or not, it would finally wake. The morning of the choosing ceremony arrived cold and bright, the kind of clear winter sky that made every sound in the forest carry farther than usual. The entire Ashford pack gathered in the great clearing before the stone hall, dressed in their finest cloaks, their breath fogging in the sharp air. Banners bearing the pack's crest, a silver wolf howling beneath a crescent moon, hung from the surrounding trees, and long tables had been set up along the edges of the clearing, heavy with food prepared for the celebration that was supposed to follow. Lyra stood near the back of the gathering, exactly where she always stood, tucked between the crowd and the tree line, close enough to see, but far enough to remain unnoticed. She had tucked her mother's journal beneath a loose stone near her sleeping mat that morning, unwilling to risk anyone discovering it, but its words stayed with her regardless, humming quietly beneath her nervousness like a secret ember. The ceremony itself followed an old and rigid structure. Alpha Alaric Hale, visibly weaker than he had been even a season ago, sat upon a raised wooden chair at the front of the gathering, flanked by the pack's senior council. One by one, the young wolves of appropriate age would be called forward, evaluated publicly for strength, loyalty, and bloodline worth, and either paired with a suitable match or passed over entirely. Cale, of course, was called first. He strode forward with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted the outcome, and the crowd murmured approvingly as his name was announced alongside a strong young female wolf from a respected hunting family. The pairing was met with applause, congratulations, and the kind of warm acceptance Lyra had spent her entire life watching from a distance, like standing outside a lit window on a freezing night. Name after name followed. Some pairings drew louder celebration than others, but every single wolf called forward received at least polite recognition, a nod from the council, a place among the pack's accepted future. Lyra watched it all with her jaw tight and her hands curled into fists at her sides, telling herself, over and over, that she had never expected to be called, that this ceremony had never been meant for someone like her. Then Garrett, standing beside the council table with the formal registry in hand, cleared his throat and called the final name on the list. Lyra Ashford. The clearing went silent in a way that felt almost violent, a silence made of held breath and barely suppressed laughter. Lyra felt every eye in the gathering turn toward her, and for one horrible frozen moment, she considered simply not moving, letting the silence stretch until someone else broke it instead. But she had promised herself, that night by the well, that night in her father's study reading her mother's careful hidden words, that she would not shrink from being seen anymore. So she stepped forward, walking the long path through the parted crowd toward the front of the clearing, her spine straight even as her stomach twisted itself into knots. Whispers followed her the entire way. Why did they even bother calling her? This has to be some kind of joke. Poor Damon, having to stand there and watch this. Lyra reached the front of the gathering and stood before the Alpha's chair, forcing herself to meet Alaric Hale's tired eyes rather than look away. Beside him, the council members exchanged glances that ranged from pity to open amusement. Her father, standing among the senior pack members near the front, kept his gaze fixed firmly on the ground, refusing to look at her at all. Alaric studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of leadership. Lyra Ashford, he said. Daughter of Beta Damon Ashford, the council has reviewed your training records and your presence at this year's trials. A pause stretched out, heavy and cruel. Somewhere behind her, Lyra heard Cale's quiet laughter, barely muffled, and the answering giggles of the wolves standing near him. It is the judgment of this council, Alaric continued, that no suitable pairing can be recommended at this time. Lyra Ashford is hereby excused from consideration for this choosing ceremony. The words landed exactly the way Lyra had known they would, and yet somehow they still struck like a physical blow. Excused from consideration. It was the polite, formal way of saying what everyone in the clearing already believed, that she was not worth pairing with anyone, that her bloodline, weak and strange as it appeared, held no value to the pack's future. The murmurs around her grew louder, some sympathetic, most simply satisfied to have their assumptions confirmed. Lyra kept her chin level, refusing to let a single tear fall in front of the entire gathered pack, though the effort of holding herself together felt like carrying a mountain on her shoulders. "There is one more matter," Alaric added, his voice softer now, almost apologetic, in a way that somehow made everything worse. "Given the current circumstances, and given the pack's need for every able body when the coming season, the Council has decided that Lyra Ashford will be reassigned from general training duties to support labor, effective immediately." Lyra's stomach dropped further. Support labor meant hunting scraps left behind by proper hunters, cleaning the dens of higher-ranking families, hauling water and firewood, the lowest and least respected tasks within the pack's structure. It was not simply exclusion from the ceremony, it was a public demotion, a formal declaration that she was no longer even considered worth training as a fighter. She wanted to argue, she wanted to scream that she had trained harder than half the wolves who had just been celebrated, that she deserved at least the chance to keep trying, but she understood, with a clarity that felt like ice settling into her chest, that arguing would accomplish nothing, except giving the crowd an even better show. So instead, she simply nodded once, said thank you for your consideration, in a voice that barely shook, and turned to walk back through the crowd toward the tree line, every step feeling heavier than the last. She caught her father's eyes for just a moment as she passed him. There was something there, buried deep beneath his careful composure, something that might have been guilt or might have simply been discomfort at having to witness his own daughter's humiliation in front of the entire pack. Whatever it was, it disappeared almost as quickly as it had surfaced, and he looked away without a word. Lyra did not stop walking until she reached the edge of the forest, far enough from the clearing that the celebration sounds faded into a distant hum. She pressed her back against a tree trunk and slid down to sit among the roots, staring blankly at the frozen ground, waiting for the tears to come. They did not come. She felt instead something colder and steadier settling into place where the hurt should have been, a kind of quiet resolve she had never quite experienced before. She thought of her mother's journal, hidden beneath the stone near her sleeping mat. She thought of Elowen's silver eyes and her strange, impossible words about a bloodline of guardians thought lost to history. She thought of Elowen's silver eyes and her strange to history. She thought of Elowen's silver eyes and her strange to history. She thought of Elowen's silver eyes and her strange to history. Like something waiting for the right season to bloom. The pack had made its judgment. Support labor. Excused from consideration. A permanent stamp confirming everything they had always believed about her. But the pack did not know what Lyra knew now. They did not know about the binding, or the bloodline, or the fire that Elowen had promised was still sleeping somewhere deep inside her, simply waiting for the right moment to finally wake. Let them believe what they wanted to believe, Lyra thought, pressing her palm flat against her chest, feeling her own heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ribs. Let them laugh now. One day, she would make sure every single one of them remembered this moment, not as the day they finally proved she was worthless, but as the last day they ever dared to believe it. She stayed in the forest until the sun began to dip low behind the trees, and by the time she finally rose to her feet and made her way back toward the pack grounds, something in her posture had changed. Something small, but unmistakable. The quiet beginning of a girl who had decided, once and for all, that she would rather be broken trying than whole and giving up. Agatha Wren was waiting for her near the healer's hut when she returned, as though she had somehow known exactly when and where Lyra would appear. The old woman said nothing at first, simply reached out and touched Lyra's arm, the way she had done weeks before. "They took away your training," Agatha said. "It was not a question. They gave me chores instead," Lyra replied, her voice flat. Agatha's clouded eyes seemed to look straight through her anyway. "Good," the old woman said, surprising Lyra so completely that she almost laughed despite everything. "Good?" Lyra repeated. "How is any of this good?" "Because now no one is watching you closely enough to notice what you truly are," Agatha said. "Sometimes the greatest gift the world can give you is being underestimated. Use it well, child. The fire does not care whether the pack believes in it. It only cares whether you are ready to carry it when it finally arrives." Lyra stared at the old woman for a long moment, turning the words over in her mind, feeling that same small, stubborn ember of hope flicker back to life inside her chest. She did not fully understand yet what was coming, or how much her life was about to change. But standing there in the fading winter light, having just endured the worst public humiliation of her entire life, Lyra Ashford felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt ready. The weeks that followed the choosing ceremony settled into a new and grinding routine. Lyra rose before dawn each day to haul water from the eastern stream, scrub the dens belonging to the pack's higher-ranking families, and gather scraps left behind by hunters, who returned each evening with far more respect than meat. The work was exhausting and thankless, filled with small daily reminders of exactly where the pack believed she belonged. Wolves who once simply ignored her now felt entitled to order her around outright, and Kale made a point of finding new, creative ways to remind her of her lowered status whenever their paths crossed. Yet something in Lyra had shifted since the ceremony, something Agatha's strange words had helped her understand. Being overlooked meant being unwatched, and being unwatched meant freedom nobody else in the pack possessed. She used it. Every night, once her chores were finally finished and the pack settled into sleep, she slipped away into the forest, not merely to train her body anymore, but to search for answers. She returned often to the small clearing where she had first met Elowen, hoping the strange woman might reappear, but the forest remained quiet, offering nothing but wind through bare branches and the distant call of night birds. Still, Lyra kept coming back, partly out of hope, and partly because the clearing had become the only place in her entire world that felt like it belonged to her alone. It was nearly 3 weeks after the ceremony, when Elowen finally returned, appearing so silently at the clearing's edge that Lyra nearly startled straight out of her skin. "You came back," Lyra said, relief and wariness mixing together in her voice. "I told you I would explain everything you needed to know," Elowen replied, stepping into the moonlight. "But time is growing shorter than I had hoped. Tell me, has anything strange happened since we last spoke? Any moments where your wolf felt closer to the surface than usual, even briefly?" Lyra thought back over the past weeks, searching for anything unusual, but found nothing beyond the ordinary aches and frustrations of a difficult season. "No," she admitted, "nothing like that." Elowen's expression grew troubled. "That is concerning, though perhaps not surprising. Bindings placed with a mother's dying will are powerful things, stronger even than most deliberate magic, because they are woven from love and desperation rather than simple intention. It may take something significant to finally break through, something that pushes you past every limit you believe you have." "What kind of something?" Lyra asked, dread creeping into her voice. "Danger," Elowen said simply. "Real, immediate, life-threatening danger. The kind that leaves no room for hesitation or doubt. I wish I could offer you a gentler path, but the truth rarely allows for gentleness, especially not for bloodlines as old and as guarded as yours." Lyra swallowed hard, absorbing the weight of those words. "You're saying I have to almost die before any of this actually helps me?" "I am saying your wolf will come when you truly need her, and not a moment before," Elowen corrected gently. "That is not the same as dying, though I understand why it may feel that way. Trust in what you carry, Lyra Ashford. When the moment comes, you will not be as alone as you believe." Before Lyra could ask what that last, cryptic statement meant, Elowen's head snapped suddenly toward the trees, her silver eyes narrowing with alarm. "Someone is coming," she whispered urgently. "I must go. Remember what I have told you, and be careful. The pack is not the only danger circling closer than you know." She vanished into the shadows just as quickly as before, leaving Lyra alone once again, with far more questions than answers. Moments later, Finn Whitlock emerged from the tree line, his brow furrowed with confusion. "Was someone else out here with you?" he asked, glancing around the empty clearing. Lyra hesitated, torn between the instinct to lie and a growing, unfamiliar desire to actually trust someone. Finn had shown her nothing but quiet decency since their first real conversation weeks ago. Small kindnesses that cost him socially among the rest of the pack, but that he offered anyway. Slowly, she decided to take the risk. "There's someone I've been talking to," she admitted. "A stranger. She knows things about my family, about my mother, that nobody else seems to know." Finn's expression shifted from confusion to careful concern. "That sounds dangerous, Lyra. Outsiders showing up near pack territory, offering secret information. That's exactly the kind of thing that gets young wolves hurt." "I know how it sounds," Lyra said, "but everything she's told me matches things I found in my mother's old journal. Things about where our family really came from. About why my wolf looks the way it does. Finn studied her for a long moment, and Lyra braced herself for disbelief, for the same dismissive laughter she had endured from nearly everyone else in her life. Instead, he simply nodded slowly. "Then I believe you," he said. "Or at least, I believe that you believe it, and that's enough for me to want to help however I can." Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in Lyra's chest at those words, a feeling she did not have a name for yet, something that felt dangerously close to trust. They talked for nearly an hour after that, sitting together on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, Lyra sharing pieces of what she had learned while Finn listened without a hint of the mockery she had come to expect from every other wolf her age. "I should get back before someone notices I'm gone," Lyra finally said, glancing up at the moon's position in the sky. Finn nodded and rose to his feet beside her. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "whatever is coming for you, whatever your mother was trying to protect, I don't think it's going to matter much longer whether the pack believes in you or not." Lyra frowned, unsure what he meant. "What makes you say that?" "Because tensions with the Thorn Pack have been rising for months," Finn said, his voice growing serious. "My father sits in on the council meetings sometimes, and from what he's said, it's not a matter of if there's conflict coming, it's a matter of when. When that happens, every single wolf in this pack is going to need every bit of strength they can find, including strength nobody bothered looking for before." Lyra absorbed that information with a slow, uneasy chill. She had heard whispers about the neighboring Thorn Pack growing bolder along the border territories, about their alpha, Garrick Thorn, expanding his influence through intimidation and force rather than diplomacy, but she had never imagined it might touch her own life directly. They walked back toward the pack grounds together in comfortable silence, parting ways just before reaching the edge of the sleeping quarters, so no one would notice them arriving together. Lyra slipped back into her small room and lay awake long into the night, turning over everything she had learned, feeling the strange, uneasy sensation of pieces finally beginning to fit together into something larger than herself. A hidden bloodline. A binding waiting to break, a war brewing on the horizon, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Lyra Ashford, the ghost runt, the girl everyone had already decided was worthless, standing quietly at the center of it, without anyone else realizing it yet. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, sleep came easily, carrying with it the strange, unfamiliar comfort of finally understanding that her story was not yet finished being written. Winter tightened its grip over the following weeks, and with it came a growing tension that even the pack's youngest members could sense drifting through the air, like smoke before a fire. Reports trickled in from the border patrols with increasing frequency, each one more troubling than the last. The Thorn Pack had been spotted marking territory well beyond their traditional boundaries. Livestock belonging to allied packs had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. A messenger sent to negotiate peaceful terms had returned with a message so insulting that Alpha Alaric Hale had not left his private quarters for 2 full days afterward. Lyra continued her assigned labor throughout this time, though she noticed the pack's usual daily rhythms growing sharper, more anxious around her. Even the wolves who normally ignored her seemed distracted now, their attention consumed by whispered conversations about weapons stockpiles and patrol schedules, rather than their usual cruelty toward her. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like watching a storm gather strength on the horizon, close enough now that everyone could feel the pressure dropping in the air. She continued her secret research whenever her exhausting chores allowed, spending stolen hours in her father's study poring over old pack records, searching for any additional mention of the Diamond Wolf bloodline, or the Western Pack her mother had supposedly come from. Most of what she found was frustratingly vague, old legends dismissed by generations of pack scholars as fireside stories meant to entertain pups rather than historical fact. But buried within one particularly ancient ledger, its pages brittle and yellowed with age, she found a passage that made her blood run cold with recognition. The ledger described a great battle fought nearly 300 years earlier, when a coalition of northern packs had faced near total destruction at the hands of an invading force from beyond the mountains. The battle had turned, according to the account, not through numbers or traditional strength, but through the intervention of a small group of warriors whose wolves shimmered like crystal beneath the moonlight, warriors capable of shielding entire packs from harm, and turning aside blows that should have proven fatal. They were called by many names in those days, the passage read, guardians, blessed ones. But the packs who fought alongside them simply called them the Diamond Kin, for their wolves seemed carved from light itself, and their loyalty burned brighter than any flame. Lyra read the passage 3 times before finally closing the ledger, her hands trembling slightly. It was real. Whatever Elowen had told her, whatever her mother had written in her hidden journal, it was not simply legend or desperate imagination. There truly had once been a bloodline like the one supposedly running through her veins, and it had once been powerful enough to change the outcome of wars. She carefully returned the ledger to its place on the shelf, careful to disturb nothing that might alert her father to her late-night visits, and made her way quietly back to her room, her mind racing with possibilities she barely dared to imagine. The following evening, the entire pack was summoned to the Great Hall for an emergency gathering, the first of its kind in Lyra's memory. She joined the crowd along with everyone else, standing near the back as always, watching as Alpha Alaric Hale addressed the assembled pack from his raised chair, his voice weaker than it had been at the choosing ceremony, but no less commanding for it. The Thorn Pack has crossed into our eastern territory without permission or warning, Alaric announced, and the crowd erupted into anxious murmuring before he raised a hand for silence. Their intentions remain unclear, though their actions speak clearly enough. We must prepare for the possibility of open conflict. Every able wolf will begin additional defensive training starting tomorrow morning, regardless of previous assignment or rank. Lyra's ears perked at those last words. Regardless of previous assignment or rank. For the first time since her humiliation at the choosing ceremony, there existed the smallest possibility that she might be allowed back into proper training, even if only out of desperate necessity, rather than genuine belief in her worth. Beside the Alpha, his advisors exchanged uneasy glances, and Lyra noticed her father among them, his jaw tight with a tension that seemed to run deeper than simple concern about the coming conflict. She wondered, not for the first time, whether he suspected anything about the truth Elowen had revealed to her, whether Selene had confided in him before her death about the bloodline she carried and the daughter she hoped to protect. The gathering dispersed shortly afterward, the pack breaking into anxious clusters to discuss preparations and strategy. Lyra lingered near the edge of the crowd, watching Kale hold court among his usual circle of friends, already boasting about how he intended to personally drive back any Thorn Pack scouts foolish enough to test their borders. Finn found her a few minutes later, his expression grim. "This is bad," he said quietly, falling into step beside her as she made her way back toward her quarters. "Garrick Thorn doesn't make idle threats. If he's pushing this hard, he's already decided conflict is coming, and he's making sure his pack is positioned to win it before the first blow even lands." "What does that mean for us?" Lyra asked. "It means the next few weeks are going to determine a lot more than just territory lines," Finn said. "It means every wolf in this pack, strong or weak, respected or overlooked, is about to matter in ways nobody expected." Lyra absorbed his words in silence, feeling the weight of everything converging around her. The binding Elowen had described, waiting only for genuine danger to finally break. The ancient bloodline hidden in her mother's dying protection. A war building on the horizon that threatened to demand more from every single pack member than they had ever been asked to give before. She did not know yet exactly how these threads would tangle together, but she felt, with a certainty she could not fully explain, that the answer was coming soon, and that when it arrived, nothing about her life within the Ashford pack would ever look the same again. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Lyra slipped out to the training grounds long after everyone else had gone quiet. She stood alone in the center of the empty clearing, where she had endured countless humiliations over the years, closed her eyes, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to imagine what it might feel like to finally stop hiding. Somewhere deep inside her chest, so faint she almost convinced herself she had imagined it, something stirred in response, a warmth unlike anything she had felt before, gone again, almost as quickly as it appeared. It was not much, but it was enough to send her back to her room with her heart racing, and enough to keep the small, stubborn ember of hope burning steadily through what remained of the long, cold night. True to the Alpha's word, additional training began the following morning, and for the first time in months, Lyra found herself standing among the general ranks of the pack, rather than hauling water or scrubbing dens. the reintroduction was not warm. Garrett assigned her to the weakest training group without comment, and several wolves openly complained about being forced to share drills with the ghost runt again. But Lyra kept her head down and threw herself into the work with a quiet, fierce determination that surprised even her. Days passed in a blur of exhausting drills, border patrol assignments, and mounting tension throughout the pack. Reports continued arriving about Thorn pack movement along the eastern boundary, each one edging closer to the heart of Ashford territory. The pack's senior wolves grew increasingly grim, and even Kale's usual swagger seemed dampened by the seriousness settling over the entire community. It was during one such border patrol, nearly 2 weeks after the emergency gathering, that everything Lyra had been quietly building toward finally came crashing together. She had been assigned, along with 3 other lower-ranked wolves, to patrol a stretch of forest along the pack's eastern edge, an area considered relatively low risk compared to the more contested northern border. The assignment should have been simple and uneventful. Instead, Lyra noticed almost immediately that something felt wrong. The other wolves assigned to her patrol group kept exchanging strange, knowing glances throughout the walk, glances that carried none of the usual nervous energy of genuine border patrol. When they reached a particularly dense section of forest, one of them, a young wolf named Corin who ran regularly with Kale's circle, suddenly claimed to hear something suspicious further east and suggested splitting up to investigate. Lyra's instincts prickled with immediate unease, but refusing an assigned patrol duty would only invite more ridicule. So she agreed, moving cautiously through the trees in the direction Corin had indicated, while the others fanned out in different paths. Within minutes, she realized she had lost sight and scent of the rest of her group entirely, alone in unfamiliar territory, far closer to the contested border than any patrol assignment should have taken her. She stopped walking, every sense alert, and felt the cold certainty settle over her that this had not been an accident. A twig snapped behind her, and Lyra spun around just in time to see Kale step out from behind a wide tree trunk, flanked by 2 more of his usual companions, their expressions carrying none of the casual mockery she was used to. This felt different, colder, more deliberate. "Kale," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing through her entire body. "What's going on?" "Nothing personal, Ghost," Kale said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But it's occurred to me that a war is coming, and wars have a funny way of making convenient accidents happen to people who don't matter much anyway." Lyra's blood ran cold as the pieces clicked into place. "This is you and me right now, Kale? A staged patrol just so you can hurt me and blame it on the Thorn pack?" "Not hurt," Kale corrected, his smile sharp and humorless. "Just leave you somewhere the Thorn scouts are known to patrol. What happens after that is really up to them, isn't it? Nobody could ever say we did anything wrong. We simply lost track of you during a chaotic border patrol. Tragic, but understandable, given current tensions." The 2 wolves beside him began circling wider, cutting off Lyra's clearest paths of retreat. She backed toward a narrow gap between 2 boulders, her heart hammering, calculating desperately for any possible advantage, any route that might let her escape this trap before it fully closed around her. "Why?" she finally asked, genuine confusion cutting through her fear. "What did I ever do to make you hate me this much?" Something flickered across Kale's face for just a moment, an expression too complicated to name, gone before Lyra could fully read it. "You didn't do anything," he admitted, almost quietly. "That's exactly the problem. You just kept surviving anyway, kept showing up, kept refusing to disappear the way everyone expected. It's annoying." Before Lyra could respond, one of the other wolves lunged toward her, forcing her to dodge sideways into the narrow gap between the boulders, buying herself only a few precious seconds. She scrambled backward, deeper into unfamiliar territory, the sound of pursuit crashing through the underbrush behind her. She ran. There was no strategy left in this moment, no careful calculation, only pure animal instinct driving her legs faster than she had ever pushed them before, branches tearing at her clothes and skin as she fled deeper into the forest, away from the boulders, away from Kale's cold laughter echoing behind her. The forest grew denser and darker the further she ran, the familiar landmarks of Ashford territory giving way to unfamiliar terrain that could only mean one thing. She had crossed, unknowingly and unwillingly, into the contested border region, exactly where Kale had intended to strand her. She burst into a small clearing, lungs burning, legs shaking with exhaustion, and skidded to a stop as three unfamiliar wolves emerged from the tree line ahead of her, their coats dark and unfamiliar, their eyes sharp with immediate, predatory interest. Thornpack scouts. Lyra's heart plummeted. She was alone, exhausted, unarmed, and standing directly in the path of three enemy wolves in contested territory. Exactly the trap Cale had engineered, whether he had fully understood the consequences or simply not cared. The lead scout, a broad-shouldered wolf with a jagged scar across his muzzle, stepped forward, his lips curling back from sharp teeth. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying a rough, unfamiliar accent. "Looks like Ashford is getting careless with their young ones. Or maybe not so careless. Maybe this one's meant as some kind of message." Lyra backed away slowly, her mind racing through every training drill she had ever practiced, searching desperately for some option that did not end in disaster. There were three of them, and one of her, in unfamiliar territory, far from any help. "I'm not a message," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the terror clawing at her chest. "I got separated from my patrol. I'm leaving right now, and there doesn't need to be any trouble." The scarred wolf laughed, low and humorless. "Doesn't work that way, little wolf. You're on Thorn territory now, whether you meant to cross or not. And Alpha Garrick has been very clear about what happens to Ashford wolves caught trespassing these days." The three scouts began advancing, spreading out to cut off every possible escape route, and Lyra felt something inside her chest twist with pure, undiluted panic. The kind of fear that strips away every thought except the desperate, animal need to survive. She had nowhere left to run, no pack backup within reach, no weapon beyond her own claws and teeth against three wolves, clearly more experienced and more dangerous than any opponent she had faced in training. This was it. This was the moment Cale had engineered, whether he had intended for it to end quite this badly or not. Lyra Ashford, alone and unwanted, finally disappearing, in a way the entire pack could dismiss as an unfortunate accident of war. The lead scout lunged. Lyra threw herself sideways, narrowly avoiding his snapping jaws, but the second scout was already moving to intercept her retreat, and she barely twisted away from his claws in time, feeling fabric tear at her shoulder as she scrambled backward. The third scout circled behind her, cutting off her final avenue of escape entirely. She was surrounded, outmatched, utterly alone. And somewhere deep inside her chest, beneath the terror and the exhaustion and the crushing certainty that she was about to lose everything, something ancient finally began to stir, drawn upward by the one thing Elowin had promised would break through even the strongest binding. Genuine, undeniable, life-threatening danger. Lyra's vision blurred at the edges as the lead scout lunged again, and this time, instead of simply dodging, she felt something inside her surge forward to meet him, something bright and powerful and entirely unfamiliar, rushing through her veins, like fire finally freed from years of careful containment. The forest around her seemed to grow suddenly, impossibly bright. The light that erupted from Lyra's body was unlike anything the forest had ever witnessed, a brilliant, blinding radiance that seemed to pour outward from beneath her very skin, forcing the three Thorn scouts to stumble backward, shielding their eyes against the sudden brightness. Lyra felt her body twisting, changing, the familiar ache of shifting racing through her limbs, but different this time, faster and stronger, and utterly without the pain that usually accompanied the transformation. When the light finally settled, Lyra was no longer standing on two legs. Where the small, pale, unremarkable wolf had once stood, now crouched a creature that seemed to have stepped directly out of legend. Her fur shimmered like polished crystal beneath the moonlight, catching and refracting every stray beam into scattered fragments of color, white and silver, and the faintest hint of blue, like light passing through the purest diamond. Her eyes, when she finally opened them, glowed with the same soft, otherworldly radiance that Elowin's had carried, though far more intense, burning with a quiet, ancient power that had waited 18 long years to finally be free. The lead scout, recovering first from his shock, snarled and lunged forward regardless, either too proud or too foolish to retreat from an opponent he could not yet understand. Lyra moved to meet him, and where her body had once been slow and clumsy in combat, it now moved with a fluid, impossible grace, as though every ounce of hesitation and self-doubt had been burned away entirely along with her old form. She sidestepped his attack with barely any effort, her paw connecting with his flank in a blow that sent him sprawling several feet away, whimpering in pained surprise. The second scout attempted to flank her from behind, but Lyra seemed to sense the movement before it fully began, spinning to meet him, with a speed that defied everything anyone had ever believed about her. The third scout, wisest or simply most frightened of the group, was already backing away toward the tree line, clearly reconsidering whatever confidence had brought him into this clearing in the first place. Lyra did not attack to kill. Something deep within her new form understood, instinctively, that her purpose was not destruction but protection, and so instead of pressing her advantage with lethal force, she drove the scouts back, again and again, using her newfound speed and strength to overwhelm and discourage, rather than to harm beyond necessity. Within minutes, all 3 Thorn scouts had retreated into the darkness of their own territory, yelping warnings to each other about the strange, glowing wolf that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. Lyra stood alone in the clearing afterward, her chest heaving, her crystalline fur catching the moonlight in ways that still felt entirely unreal, as though she were watching this scene happen to someone else, entirely rather than living it herself. Slowly, carefully, she shifted back to her human form, half expecting the transformation to feel like waking from an impossible dream. It did not. Her body still hummed with quiet, residual power. A warmth settled deep in her chest that had never existed there before, or perhaps had always existed there, simply waiting patiently for this exact moment to finally be acknowledged. She made her way back toward Ashford territory in something of a daze, her mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. By the time she reached the pack's border markers, word had already begun to spread. One of the fleeing Thorn scouts had apparently been spotted by an Ashford patrol shortly after the encounter, babbling incoherently about a glowing wolf with crystal fur that had appeared out of nowhere and driven 3 trained scouts into full retreat without a single serious injury on either side. By the time Lyra reached the pack grounds, a crowd had already gathered, drawn by the frantic rumors circulating faster than any messenger could have carried them. She walked into the clearing exhausted, her clothes torn, her hair disheveled, and found nearly the entire pack staring at her, with expressions ranging from confusion to open disbelief. Finn reached her first, pushing through the gathered crowd with visible relief flooding his face. "You're alive," he said, gripping her shoulders, as though checking she was truly real. "We heard the scouts talking about some kind of attack near the border. Lyra, what happened out there?" Before Lyra could formulate any kind of answer, Agatha Wren's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, calm and certain, in a way that immediately drew every eye toward the old woman as she made her way forward, her blind eyes somehow seeming to see straight through Lyra despite their clouded surface. "It has finally happened," Agatha announced, her voice carrying easily across the silent clearing. "The fire I sensed all those years ago has finally woken." "What are you talking about?" someone called out from the crowd, and Agatha turned toward the voice, her expression solemn. "This child has been carrying a bloodline older and rarer than any of us truly understood," Agatha said. "A bloodline this pack dismissed, mocked, and nearly destroyed through simple ignorance. Tonight, that bloodline finally revealed itself, and I suspect every one of you standing here is about to understand exactly how wrong you have all been." The crowd erupted into stunned murmuring, disbelief warring visibly with the undeniable evidence of Lyra's exhausted, disheveled state and the wild reports already circulating about the encounter at the border. Cale pushed his way through the crowd, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear, and Lyra met his eyes steadily, refusing to look away this time. "You did this," she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearest to hear. "You set me up to die out there, Cale. And instead, I found something you never expected me to find." Cale's mouth opened, then closed again, no clever response ready for the first time Lyra could ever remember. Around them, the crowd's murmuring grew louder, questions and disbelief, and dawning realization, all tangled together, as the pack began to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that everything they had believed about the ghost runt might have been catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong. Her father pushed through the crowd next, his expression unreadable as he studied her, his eyes lingering on features that must have suddenly, painfully reminded him of the wife he had lost 18 years earlier. "Lyra," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never once heard from him before. "Is it true?" Lyra held his gaze steadily, feeling, for the first time in her entire life, something other than fear or shame beneath her father's attention. "I don't know everything yet," she admitted, "but I know I'm not what this pack decided I was. Not anymore." The clearing fell into a heavy, uncertain silence, the entire pack standing frozen, in the aftermath of a revelation none of them had been prepared for, while Lyra stood at the center of it, exhausted, glowing faintly still beneath her skin, no longer the ghost runt anyone had known, but something entirely new, entirely powerful, and entirely her own. News of what happened at the border spread through the Ashford pack faster than any formal announcement could have managed, twisting and growing with each retelling, until Lyra found herself the subject of 100 different rumors by the following morning. Some claimed she had single-handedly defeated an entire Thorn war party. Others whispered that she had transformed into something not quite wolf at all, something closer to spirit or myth. The truth, though remarkable enough on its own, seemed almost mundane compared to the wild stories already circulating. Alpha Alaric Hale summoned Lyra to the Great Hall that same morning, along with her father, Agatha Wren, and the full pack council. Lyra walked through the pack grounds toward the hall, acutely aware of every eye that followed her. Wolves, who had ignored her for years, now watching with open, unashamed curiosity. It should have felt satisfying after so many years of humiliation. Instead, it mostly felt strange and overwhelming, like stepping into a life that belonged to someone else entirely. Inside the Great Hall, Alaric sat waiting with the council members arranged around him, their expressions ranging from cautious skepticism to poorly hidden excitement. Agatha stood near the Alpha's chair, and Lyra noticed with some surprise that her father had positioned himself close beside her, rather than among the council as usual. "Tell us exactly what happened," Alaric said, his tired eyes fixed on Lyra, with an intensity she had never experienced from him before. Lyra recounted the encounter carefully, describing the staged patrol, though she left out Cale's specific involvement for the moment, unsure yet how much trouble she truly wanted to unleash. She described crossing unknowingly into contested territory, the 3 Thorn scouts, and the overwhelming fear that had somehow triggered a transformation unlike anything she had ever experienced. When she finished, Agatha stepped forward, addressing the council directly. "What this child is describing matches historical records nearly forgotten by this pack," she said. "There exists an ancient bloodline, nearly extinct for centuries, known as the Diamond Kin, guardians whose wolves manifest under extreme threat, wolves capable of protection and strength beyond ordinary shifters. I have long suspected Celine Ashford carried traces of this bloodline. Last night, it seems, those suspicions were finally confirmed beyond any doubt." The council erupted into a flurry of questions and disbelief, several members openly skeptical despite the evidence, until Alaric raised a hand for silence. "Can you demonstrate this transformation now?" he asked Lyra directly. "Under controlled circumstances, so this council can see the truth with their own eyes, rather than relying on rumor and second-hand accounts." Lyra hesitated, uncertain whether she could even summon the transformation deliberately, given that it had emerged the previous night purely from desperate, uncontrolled fear. But she nodded anyway, understanding that proof, undeniable and immediate, was exactly what this moment required. She closed her eyes, reaching inward toward that strange, warm sensation she had felt settle into her chest after the encounter at the border, and to her own quiet astonishment, found it there waiting for her, steady and patient, no longer requiring desperation or terror to answer her call. The shift came smoothly, gracefully, and within moments, the crystalline wolf stood once again in the center of the Great Hall, her fur catching and scattering the light from the hall's torches into countless shimmering fragments. The council fell utterly silent, several members rising from their seats in open astonishment. Even Alaric, weakened by illness and decades of leadership, leaned forward in his chair with an expression of genuine wonder Lyra had never expected to see directed toward her. "Remarkable," one council member finally breathed. "Absolutely remarkable." Lyra shifted back to her human form, feeling suddenly, strangely exposed beneath the weight of so much attention. Her father stepped forward then, and for the first time in her entire memory, he reached out and pulled her into an embrace, his arms tight around her shoulders, his voice rough with emotion when he finally spoke. Your mother would be so proud of you, he said quietly, only for her to hear. I'm sorry it took me this long to see what she always knew was there. Lyra felt tears finally slip free, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming release of 18 years of carrying a weight she had never fully understood until now. The council continued discussing implications and next steps around them, but for one long moment, none of that mattered beyond the simple, long-overdue comfort of her father's arms. The following days brought changes to Lyra's life so rapid and dramatic that she often felt as though she were living inside someone else's story entirely. Wolves who had mocked her for years now approached with careful, awkward apologies, some sincere, and some clearly motivated by fear of what she now represented. Cale avoided her entirely, though word eventually reached her that his role in staging the border incident had been discovered and formally punished by the council, stripped of several privileges and placed under close supervision for the foreseeable future. Training resumed, but everything about it had changed. Garrett, once dismissive, now personally oversaw her development with evident enthusiasm, eager to help refine abilities that promised to reshape the pack's future entirely. Finn remained a steady, welcome presence throughout it all, one of the few people whose treatment of her never wavered, whether she had been the Ghost Runt or the pack's newest legend. Yet even amid the sudden acceptance and celebration, Lyra found herself unable to fully relax into her new circumstances. The threat from the Thorn Pack had not disappeared simply because her wolf had finally awakened. If anything, reports suggested Garrick Thorn had grown even more aggressive after hearing rumors of the mysterious glowing wolf that had driven back his scouts, apparently determined to understand and neutralize whatever new threat the Ashford Pack now possessed. And there remained the deeper question hanging over everything, one that Agatha Wren finally voiced aloud during a quiet conversation held several days after the council meeting. With Alaric's health failing, and conflict with the Thorn Pack becoming increasingly inevitable, the Pack Council has begun discussing the Alpha trials, Agatha said, finding Lyra alone by the same stone well where their first meaningful conversation had taken place months earlier. Given what you have revealed yourself to be, several council members have already suggested your name be added among the candidates. Lyra stared at the old woman in genuine shock. Me? Alpha? I've been part of this pack's actual training for less than a week. Strength is not measured only in time spent training, child, Agatha replied. It is measured in resilience, in judgment, in the willingness to protect others even when protection was never offered to you in return. You have already proven more of those qualities than most candidates twice your experience. The council would be foolish not to at least consider you. Lyra sat with that thought long after Agatha had shuffled away, staring out at the darkening tree line, feeling the familiar knot of uncertainty tighten in her stomach, even as something new and unfamiliar stirred alongside it, something that might have been ambition, or perhaps simply the quiet, dawning belief that she deserved to be considered for things she had once believed entirely impossible. The Alpha trials were coming, and for the first time in her life, Lyra Ashford would not be standing at the edge of the crowd wondering if she belonged. She would be standing at the very center of it, ready to prove exactly how wrong everyone had once been. The council's formal announcement came 3 days later, confirming what Agatha had already predicted. The Alpha trials would take place within the month, accelerated once again by the worsening situation along the Thorn border. 4 candidates would compete for the right to lead the Ashford Pack into whatever conflict lay ahead, their names posted publicly outside the Great Hall for the entire pack to see. Lyra Ashford's name stood among them, alongside Cale Hale, a respected senior hunter named Rowan Blackwood, and a skilled young fighter named Nessa Faircroft who had long been considered one of the pack's strongest natural competitors. The pack's reaction to Lyra's inclusion was mixed, unsurprisingly. Some had already fully embraced the idea of the Diamond Wolf, leading them into an uncertain future, drawn by the promise of protection and strength her bloodline represented. Others remained skeptical, whispering that a girl who had spent 18 years as the pack's lowest-ranked member could not possibly possess the leadership, wisdom, and political judgment required to guide an entire pack through war. Lyra found herself agreeing with the skeptics more often than she cared to admit. Her wolf had proven powerful, undeniably so, but leadership required far more than raw strength, and she had spent almost no time learning the political maneuvering, strategic planning, or diplomatic skill that pack leadership traditionally demanded. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted to Finn one evening, as they walked together along the training grounds after another exhausting day of preparation. "Nobody is ever fully ready," Finn replied. "Cale has spent his entire life being groomed for this exact moment, and even he doesn't actually understand what real leadership requires yet. You have something the others don't, Lyra. You know what it feels like to be overlooked, to be underestimated, to have people decide your worth before ever actually seeing you. That kind of understanding matters more than you think, especially for a pack that's about to need someone who genuinely cares about protecting every single member, not just the strong ones." Lyra turned his words over carefully as the trials approached, drawing what confidence she could from them, even as her nerves continued building. The trials themselves consisted of several stages spread across multiple days, testing physical strength, strategic thinking, and the less tangible qualities of judgment and character that the Pack Council considered equally essential. The physical trials proved to be Lyra's clearest advantage. Her crystalline wolf form, once fully embraced rather than feared, demonstrated speed and resilience that none of the other candidates could match, and she found herself advancing through combat challenges with a confidence that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Cale remained close behind her throughout these stages, his natural strength and years of dedicated training keeping him firmly competitive despite the recent damage to his reputation. The strategic trials proved considerably more difficult. Candidates were presented with complex hypothetical scenarios involving territory disputes, resource allocation, and diplomatic negotiations, forced to demonstrate their reasoning before the assembled council. Lyra struggled through the early strategic challenges, her lack of formal leadership experience showing clearly against candidates like Rowan Blackwood, whose decades of hunting leadership had given him considerable practical wisdom. Yet Lyra discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that her years spent watching the pack from its margins had taught her something the other candidates lacked entirely: a clear, unflinching understanding of how decisions actually affected the pack's lowest-ranked members, the ones typically forgotten in strategic planning sessions, dominated by voices from positions of comfort and privilege. When asked how she would handle resource shortages during a prolonged conflict, Lyra's answer, focused on equitable distribution and protecting the pack's most vulnerable members first, earned quiet, thoughtful nods from several council members who had clearly not expected such consideration from any candidate. The final and most significant stage of the trials arrived on a cold, clear morning, nearly 3 weeks after the initial announcement, just as reports from the eastern border grew increasingly urgent. Garrick Thorne had begun openly massing forces along contested territory, and pack scouts reported growing certainty that open conflict would erupt within days rather than weeks. The council decided, given the mounting urgency, that the final trial would take a form never before used in Ashford history, a direct confrontation designed specifically to test each candidate's readiness for the exact crisis now bearing down upon them. Rather than a purely internal competition, the final trial would involve leading a defensive response to increasingly aggressive Thorn Pack incursions along the border, with each remaining candidate given command of a small patrol group to demonstrate real leadership under genuine, immediate pressure. Lyra was assigned command of a mixed patrol group consisting of 6 wolves, several of whom had mocked her openly only weeks earlier, and now found themselves uncertain how to treat the same girl they were now required to follow into potential danger. She gathered them before departing, forcing herself to project a confidence she did not entirely feel. "I know most of you have reasons to doubt whether I deserve to be leading this patrol," she said honestly, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I promise you this: every decision I make out there will be about bringing every single one of you home safely, not about proving anything to anyone watching. If that's not enough for you, I understand. But it's the truth, and it's all I have to offer." The patrol departed shortly after, moving cautiously toward the contested eastern border, where Thorn Pack activity had been most concentrated in recent days. Lyra kept her group moving carefully, drawing on everything she had learned during her own difficult years of training, watching for signs of ambush, maintaining careful formation, and communicating clearly with every member of her patrol, rather than issuing orders without explanation. They encountered a Thorn scouting party barely an hour into their patrol, 5 wolves testing the border defenses in a probing maneuver, clearly designed to gauge Ashford readiness. Lyra's instincts, honed through months of secret training and genuine desperation, guided her patrol through a careful, coordinated response that drove back the scouting party without a single serious injury on either side. A remarkable outcome, given the tension surrounding every border encounter in recent weeks. More significantly, Lyra noticed something the other candidates' reports later revealed they had missed entirely. Among the retreating Thorn scouts, she spotted unusual markings on several of their weapons, unfamiliar symbols that did not match traditional Thorn pack designs. When she reported this detail to the council upon her patrol's return, it triggered immediate, urgent investigation. The markings, it was soon discovered, belonged to a mercenary group known for selling their services to packs desperate enough to seek outside help in territorial conflicts, suggesting Garrick Thorn's aggression stemmed not purely from ambition, but from external pressure and resources. Lyra's understanding of the tension had somehow allowed her to notice where others had overlooked it. The council convened that same evening to announce their final decision regarding the Alpha trials, the mounting urgency of the border situation demanding resolution before any further delay could risk the pack's safety. Lyra stood alongside the other three candidates in the Great Hall, her heart pounding as Alaric Hale, visibly weaker with each passing day, rose slowly from his chair to address the assembled pack. "This decision has not come easily," he began, his voice carrying clearly, despite his obvious frailty. "Each candidate before you has demonstrated genuine strength and dedication throughout these trials. But leadership, especially leadership required to guide this pack through the conflict now bearing down upon us, demands more than strength alone. It demands the wisdom to notice what others overlook, the compassion to protect every member regardless of rank, and the resilience forged not despite hardship, but through it." Lyra's breath caught as Alaric's gaze settled directly on her, and the entire Great Hall seemed to hold its breath alongside her, waiting for the words that would determine not only her future, but the future of the entire Ashford pack, as it prepared to face the greatest threat it had encountered in generations. "It is the decision of this council," Alaric continued, his voice growing steadier with each word, "that Lyra Ashford shall lead this pack forward as its next Alpha, effective immediately, given the urgency of the crisis we now face." The Great Hall erupted, a chaotic mixture of stunned silence, disbelieving murmurs, and scattered applause that grew steadily louder as the shock of the announcement settled into genuine acceptance. Lyra stood frozen at the center of it all, hardly able to process words she had never truly allowed herself to imagine hearing, not after a lifetime of being told, in 1,000 small and large ways, that she would never amount to anything the pack valued. Cale stepped forward from among the other candidates, and for one tense moment, Lyra braced herself for anger or resentment. Instead, he offered a slow, genuine nod, something that looked remarkably like respect settling into his expression. "You earned this," he said quietly, only for her to hear. "I spent my whole life being told I deserved to lead. You spent yours proving it instead. That matters more." There was little time to fully absorb the enormity of the moment, however, as reports arrived within hours confirming everyone's worst fears. Garrick Thorn, likely emboldened by mercenary reinforcements, had begun a full advance toward Ashford territory, clearly intending to strike before the pack could properly organize under new leadership. The timing, cruel and immediate, meant Lyra's very first act, as Alpha would be leading her pack into the exact conflict everyone had feared for months. She did not have the luxury of easing into her new role. Within hours of the council's announcement, Lyra found herself standing before the assembled pack once more, no longer as a candidate or an overlooked outsider, but as their newly appointed Alpha, tasked with organizing their defense against an invasion that could arrive within a single day. Drawing on everything she had learned, from her months of secret training, to the political lessons absorbed during the trials, to the quiet wisdom Agatha Wren had shared with her since childhood, Lyra organized the pack's defenses with a clarity and decisiveness that surprised even her most skeptical critics. She positioned her strongest fighters along the most vulnerable approaches, ensured every wolf understood their role and had a clear line of retreat if needed, and made certain, above all else, that no member of the pack, regardless of rank or history, would be left unprotected or forgotten in the chaos that was coming. The Thorn pack arrived at dawn the following morning, their numbers bolstered significantly by the mercenary forces Lyra's earlier observation had helped identify. Garrick Thorn himself led the advance, a massive, battle-scarred wolf whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had spread throughout the Northern Territories for years. The battle that followed was fierce and chaotic, wolves clashing across the contested border in a desperate struggle that tested every ounce of preparation Lyra's leadership had provided. She fought alongside her pack rather than commanding safely from a distance, her crystalline form cutting through the chaos with a speed and resilience that repeatedly turned the tide in critical moments, shielding wounded pack members and driving back attackers who threatened to break through Ashford lines. The turning point came when Garrick Thorne himself broke through the Ashford defenses near the pack's central grounds, clearly intending to end the conflict decisively by eliminating their newly appointed alpha before her leadership could fully solidify. Lyra met him directly, her crystalline wolf standing against his massive, scarred form, in a confrontation that drew the attention of both packs still fighting around them. The fight was brutal and exhausting, Garrick's raw strength and decades of combat experience pressing Lyra harder than anything she had faced before. But where his strength relied purely on force, Lyra's newly awakened abilities carried something deeper, an instinctive understanding of protection and resilience woven into the very fabric of her bloodline. She did not simply fight to defeat him. She fought to end the conflict entirely, using precise, controlled strikes designed to disable rather than destroy, understanding instinctively that a swift, decisive end to the confrontation would save far more lives than a prolonged, bloody struggle. Finally, after several exhausting minutes that felt like hours, Lyra managed to pin Garrick Thorne firmly to the ground, her crystalline claws positioned carefully at his throat, close enough to end the confrontation permanently, but controlled enough to offer him one final choice. "This ends now," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet battlefield, as both packs paused to witness the outcome. "Not with more death. Call off your forces, Garrick Thorne, and we can begin discussing genuine peace, instead of endless conflict neither of our packs can afford to sustain." Garrick, defeated and clearly recognizing the shifted balance of power, finally nodded, calling out the order for his forces to withdraw. The battlefield fell into a strange, uncertain quiet as both packs slowly disengaged, the immediate threat of full-scale war averted through Lyra's combination of strength and restraint. In the weeks that followed, formal peace negotiations began between the Ashford and Thorne packs, along with several other northern territories eager to establish stronger alliances, now that word of the Diamond Wolf's return had spread throughout the region. Alpha leaders from neighboring packs traveled to Ashford territory to formally acknowledge the shift in power, drawn by both respect for Lyra's demonstrated strength and genuine curiosity about the legendary bloodline many had believed extinct for centuries. At a formal gathering held beneath the same great hall where Lyra had once stood humiliated and dismissed, representatives from 6 different packs knelt before her in a formal show of respect and alliance, acknowledging her leadership and the protection her bloodline promised to extend across the region in the uncertain times ahead. Even Garrick Thorne, standing stiffly among the assembled alphas, offered a respectful bow, a gesture that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Lyra stood at the center of it all, surrounded by wolves who had once believed her worthless, now bowing before her, not out of fear alone, but out of genuine, earned respect. Her father stood nearby, his expression carrying a quiet pride that had taken 18 years to fully surface. Finn stood close beside her throughout the ceremony, his steady presence a reminder of the kindness that had never wavered regardless of her circumstances. Even Agatha Wren, standing near the front of the gathering, wore an expression of quiet satisfaction, as though she had known, all along, exactly how this story was always meant to unfold. As the last of the visiting alphas rose from their formal bow, Lyra allowed herself, for just a moment, to remember the frightened, overlooked girl who had once sat alone by the stone well, wondering if something inside her was simply broken beyond repair. That girl had been wrong about herself, though understandably so, given everything the world around her had insisted was true. She had never been broken. She had simply been waiting, patiently and painfully, for the right moment to finally bloom. And now, standing tall before a pack and a region that had learned, sometimes painfully, to see her true worth, Lyra Ashford understood at last that true strength had never depended on size, or speed, or the easy approval of those quick to judge. It had always been about the quiet, stubborn fire that refused to go out, even in the coldest, loneliest darkness, waiting faithfully for the moment it would finally be allowed to shine.